Have you ever been held hostage by something that loved you too much to let you get hurt? Marcus Chen stared at the door of the research station, then looked down at the three furry masses planted firmly between him and the exit, their amber eyes gleaming with unmistakable stubbornness. The Krenith cubs, each one the size of a young German shepherd but built like miniature saber-toothed panthers, had arranged themselves in a perfect semicircle, their silvery blue pelts bristling in that particular way that meant they weren't moving for anyone or anything. "Okay," Marcus said slowly, setting down his thermal pack. This is new. He'd been on Laura 7 for 6 months now, part of the first long-term human research expedition to the planet, and he'd thought he understood the cubs by now. When he'd first arrived, the indigenous Valorians had warned him about the Krenith apex predators of the Northern Territories, dangerous even as juveniles. But somewhere along the way, these three orphan cubs had decided that Marcus was their pack. They followed him everywhere, slept outside his quarters, and had even started bringing him their kills, which was simultaneously disgusting and oddly touching. But they had never, not once, blocked his exit before. "You know I have to check the atmospheric sensors, right?" Marcus tried reasoning with them, feeling slightly ridiculous for attempting logic with what were essentially alien lion cubs. "The readings were off this morning, and if there's a contamination leak, we need to catch it early." The largest cub, whom Marcus had privately named Bear because of his bulk, let out a low rumbling sound that vibrated through the floor. Not a growl. Marcus had learned to distinguish their vocalizations, but something closer to a concerned whine. The other two, smaller and sleeker, he called them Ghost and Shadow for their coloring and their tendency to appear silently out of nowhere, pressed closer together, effectively sealing off any gap he might try to squeeze through. "This is ridiculous," Marcus muttered, running a hand through his dark hair. "I'm being held prisoner by glorified kittens." He was still contemplating his options when he heard footsteps behind him and caught the familiar scent of starlight, jasmine, and impossible description, but the closest his human brain could come to processing the subtle luminescent oils that Valorians naturally exuded. "They won't move for you," came a voice like wind chimes made of silver, carrying just a hint of amusement. "Not today." Marcus turned to find Vera standing in the corridor, her arms crossed over her fitted tactical jacket, her platinum hair cascading over one shoulder like liquid moonlight. She was watching the scene with an expression that danced somewhere between concern and barely suppressed laughter. Even after 6 months, Marcus still found himself momentarily struck by her appearance, so achingly human in most respects, with delicate features and expressive amber eyes, yet undeniably alien in the elegant points of her ears and the subtle glow that seemed to emanate from beneath her flawless skin. As his assigned cultural liaison and research partner, Vera had become the closest thing he had to a friend on this planet. Maybe, if he was being honest with himself in those quiet moments before sleep, something more than a friend. But that was a thought he kept carefully locked away, buried under layers of professionalism and the certainty that an alien woman couldn't possibly feel the same way about a strange creature from another world. "What do you mean they won't move?" Marcus asked, gesturing at the cubs in frustration. "They've never done this before." "I need to get outside, Vera." "The sensor readings are fine," she interrupted, moving closer. Her footsteps were nearly silent, even in her practical boots, another reminder that her people had evolved from ambush hunters, graceful and deadly when they chose to be. "I checked them myself this morning." The anomaly was a false reading caused by ice crystal interference. Marcus blinked. Ice crystal interference? But it was supposed to be mid-spring on this hemisphere. The temperature predictions said the predictions were wrong. Vera's expression shifted, the amusement fading into something more serious. "A cold snap moved in overnight. The kind my people call a kirveth, a death wind. The temperature out there right now is -62 by your Celsius measurement, with wind chill pushing it closer to -90. Marcus felt his stomach drop. At those temperatures, exposed human skin would freeze in under a minute. Even with full thermal gear, he'd have maybe 20 minutes before hypothermia became a serious risk. The station's environmental systems were designed for cold, but not that cold, not cold enough to warrant a full-pressure suit for a simple sensor check. "The cubs knew," he said slowly, looking back at the three furry guardians still planted firmly in front of the door. "They sensed the temperature drop and they wouldn't let me go outside." Vera nodded, a soft smile playing at the corners of her lips. "Krenith are remarkably intuitive creatures. Their pack bonds run deeper than most species give them credit for. They've claimed you as one of their own, Marcus. To them, letting you walk into a Kirveth would be the same as watching you walk off a cliff. She moved to stand beside him, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. Valorians ran several degrees hotter than humans, which had made her an unexpectedly pleasant presence during the cooler months. What I find more interesting, she continued, her voice dropping to something more thoughtful, is that they positioned themselves before you even approached the door. They anticipated your routine. They knew you would try to leave this morning, and they decided independently to prevent it. Marcus crouched down slowly, bringing himself to eye level with Bear. The cub's amber eyes met his with unsettling intelligence, and for a moment, Marcus could have sworn he saw something ancient and knowing in that gaze. Something that said, quite clearly, "You're welcome. You stupid, soft creature." "Thank you," Marcus said quietly, extending his hand palm up in the gesture Vera had taught him, the Valorian equivalent of showing peaceful intent to a predator. Bear sniffed his hand once, then pressed his massive head against Marcus's palm with a rumbling purr that seemed to shake the walls. Ghost and Shadow immediately tried to squeeze in, demanding their own share of attention, and Marcus found himself laughing as he was nearly bowled over by enthusiastic alien felines. Vera watched the scene with an expression Marcus couldn't quite read. Her amber eyes had softened in a way he'd rarely seen, and there was something vulnerable in the slight parting of her lips. The way her hand reached up unconsciously to touch the pendant at her throat, a carved crystal that she'd once told him was a family heirloom, passed down through generations of her line. "They really do love him," she murmured, almost too quiet for Marcus to hear. "Not just as a pack member, but as something precious, something worth protecting at any cost." She wasn't sure if she was still talking about the cubs. The Kirveth lasted for 3 days. 3 days of howling winds that rattled the station walls and temperatures that would have killed Marcus in minutes. 3 days of the cubs refusing to leave his side, piling onto his bed at night in a warm, furry heap that made it nearly impossible to move, but kept him warmer than any heating system could have. And 3 days of Vera finding increasingly creative excuses to spend time in his quarters, sharing meals and stories and comfortable silences that felt more intimate than any conversation Marcus had ever had. On the second night, as the wind screamed outside and the cubs dozed in a puppy pile by the heating vent, Marcus and Vera sat together on his small couch, sharing a bottle of something she'd called frost wine, a Valorian specialty brewed from flowers that only bloomed during cold snaps like this one. It tasted like honeyed starlight, if such a thing were possible, with a warmth that spread through his chest and made his thoughts feel pleasantly fuzzy around the edges. "Can I ask you something?" Vera said, her voice slightly hesitant in a way that was uncharacteristic for her. She was usually so confident, so certain in everything she did, that this moment of vulnerability made Marcus's heart clench in ways he didn't want to examine too closely. "Anything," he replied, and meant it. Vera was quiet for a long moment, staring into the depths of her wine glass, as if searching for courage in its swirling contents. When she finally spoke, her words came out in a rush, like she was afraid she'd lose her nerve if she slowed down. "Why do you stay here? I mean, on VE Laura 7. Your assignment ended 2 months ago. I know because I processed the paperwork myself. You could have gone back to Earth, back to your own people, but you requested an extension, and then another, and another." She looked up at him then, her amber eyes catching the low light in a way that made them glow like twin suns. "Why? What's keeping you here?" Marcus felt his heart rate spike. The cubs, dozing nearby, lifted their heads simultaneously, their ears perking at the sudden change in his biochemistry. He'd often wondered if they could smell emotional shifts the way dogs supposedly could on Earth. Now he was fairly certain the answer was yes. "The research is important," he started, falling back on the safe professional answer. "The atmospheric studies, the cultural documentation." Marcus, Vera's voice was soft but firm. "I've read your reports. You're thorough, but you're not passionate about atmospheric particulate analysis. No one is. That's not why you stay." She set down her wine glass and turned to face him fully, tucking her legs beneath her on the couch. This close, Marcus could count the tiny luminescent freckles scattered across her cheeks like stars. "Please," she said, and the word came out smaller than he'd ever heard from her. "Tell me the truth." And maybe it was the frost wine, or the howling wind creating a cocoon of isolation that made the outside world feel very far away. or the fact that 3 alien predators had literally blocked him from walking into his own death because they loved him. But Marcus found himself saying something he'd sworn he would never say out loud. You, he admitted. You're what's keeping me here. Vera's breath caught audibly. Her eyes widened, those elegant, pointed ears tilting forward in what he'd learned was the Valorian equivalent of intense focus. Me, she whispered. Marcus nodded, feeling like he was standing on the edge of that cliff the cubs had metaphorically saved him from. Except this time there were no fuzzy guardians to hold him back. I know it's probably inappropriate. You're my liaison. We're supposed to be colleagues, and I'm an alien here literally, and you probably see me the same way I see the cubs. Something strange and foreign that wandered into your life and he didn't get to finish. Vera moved forward and pressed her lips to his, cutting off his rambling with a kiss that tasted like frost wine and something uniquely her. Something that made his nerve endings sing and his thoughts scatter like startled birds. It was gentle at first, tentative, but when he responded, his hand coming up to cup her face, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone, she made a soft sound that might have been relief or joy or some Valorian emotion that didn't have an earth equivalent. And the kiss deepened into something that felt like coming home. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Vera rested her forehead against his. Her skin was warm, almost feverish by human standards, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. I've been waiting 6 months for you to say something, she admitted, her voice shaky with laughter. I thought you didn't. I thought humans didn't find Valorians attractive, or that I was misreading your signals, or you're beautiful, Marcus interrupted, because it seemed important to say, and brilliant, and terrifying sometimes in a good way. And I've been in love with you since the day you told off that ambassador for suggesting humans were cognitively limited just because we can't see ultraviolet light, Vera laughed. A bright sound that made the cub's ears perk up with interest. He deserved it. The man was insufferably smug. He was, Marcus agreed. But you verbally eviscerated him in 3 languages while maintaining perfect diplomatic courtesy. It was the most attractive thing I'd ever seen. They talked through the rest of the night, curled together on the couch while the Kirveth raged outside. They talked about everything and nothing: her childhood on the equatorial continent, his family back on Earth, the future that suddenly seemed full of possibilities that hadn't existed before. They talked about how they were going to navigate being together when they came from different worlds. And they talked about how maybe that didn't matter as much as they'd feared it would. And the cubs, those strange alien predators who had decided a fragile human was worth protecting, gradually migrated from their spot by the heating vent to arrange themselves around the couch like furry sentinels, their rumbling purrs a constant backdrop to the conversation. On the morning of the 3rd day, the Kirveth finally broke. Marcus woke to silence, not the oppressive silence of danger, but the peaceful quiet of a world catching its breath after a storm. Vera was still asleep beside him, her platinum hair spread across his chest, one arm thrown possessively over his waist. The cubs were nowhere to be seen. That last detail penetrated his sleep-fogged brain with alarming clarity. The cubs were never nowhere to be seen. They were either plastered against him like oversized hot water bottles or positioned at the door like furry security guards. Their absence was unprecedented and, given everything that had happened over the past few days, slightly terrifying. Marcus extracted himself from Vera's embrace as carefully as possible. She made a sleepy sound of protest but didn't wake and padded toward the door of his quarters. What he found when he opened it made him stop dead in his tracks. The cubs were sitting in a perfect line in the corridor, their postures alert but relaxed. At their feet, arranged with surprising care, was a collection of objects: 3 crystalline flowers that Marcus recognized as the rare frost blooms that only appeared after a Kirveth, still glittering with morning ice. A small animal that had clearly been freshly caught, but notably not eaten. And something that made Marcus's breath catch in his throat: a carved crystal pendant, similar to the one Vera wore, except this one was raw and unpolished, clearly pulled from somewhere in the wild. Vera looked up at Marcus with those 2 intelligent amber eyes and let out a low, purposeful chirp. It was a sound Marcus had never heard before, but he understood its meaning as clearly as if the cub had spoken English. We approve. She is packed now too. Marcus felt tears prick at his eyes, which was ridiculous. He was a grown man, a scientist, and he was not going to cry over alien cat presents. But his vision was definitely blurring as he crouched down and gathered all 3 cubs into the biggest hug his arms could manage. Thank you, he whispered into Bear's thick fur. for saving my life, for accepting her, for all of it. Ghost licked his face with a tongue like sandpaper. Shadow tried to climb onto his shoulders, which was significantly more challenging now than it had been when they were smaller. And Bear just rumbled contentedly, his massive head pressed against Marcus's chest, like he was listening to his heartbeat. Marcus? Bear's voice came from behind him, still fuzzy with sleep. What are you? Oh? She had emerged from the quarters and stopped, taking in the scene before her. The cubs, the gifts. Marcus, openly crying into Bear's fur while being assaulted by enthusiastic alien affection. Her hand went to her throat, to the pendant she always wore, and her eyes locked onto the matching crystal lying among the frost blooms. They gave me a binding stone, she whispered, and there was something like awe in her voice. Marcus, do you understand what that means? In my culture, in the old traditions, when a Krenith pack offers a binding stone to someone outside their bond group, it's what? Marcus asked, looking up at her through tear-blurred eyes. Vera was crying too, he realized. Tears tracked down her luminescent cheeks like liquid silver, and her smile was so bright it almost hurt to look at. It's a blessing, she said. The highest blessing a pack can give. They're saying that you're theirs, and I'm yours, and therefore I'm theirs too. They're welcoming me into the family, Marcus. Your family, our family. She sank down to the floor beside him, and the cubs immediately expanded their circle of affection to include her, rumbling and chirping, and generally making it very difficult for either human to breathe. But Marcus didn't mind. For the first time since he'd arrived on this strange, beautiful, terrifying planet, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. So, he said, his voice muffled by fur and aliens, and the woman he loved pressed against his side. I guess I'm definitely not going back to Earth now. Bear laughed, bright and joyful, and kissed his cheek. I guess not. Bear chose that moment to let out an enormous yawn, displaying a truly impressive array of teeth, and then flopped onto his side with a thud that shook the floor. Ghost and Shadow immediately piled on top of him, and after a moment's consideration, both Marcus and Vera let themselves be pulled into the puppy pile as well. It was ridiculous. It was undignified. It was possibly the happiest moment of Marcus's entire life. Outside, the first rays of sunlight were breaking through the post-storm clouds, painting the frozen landscape in shades of gold and rose. The Kirveth had passed, and a new warmth was beginning to spread across Velora 7, not just in the atmosphere, but in the small research station where a human and a Valorian lay tangled together with 3 alien cubs who had decided, in their own predatory way, that love was worth protecting at any cost. And if Marcus occasionally found himself being aggressively herded away from cold drafts and bundled in blankets by his furry guardians for the rest of his days, well, that was just the price of being part of a pack that loved him too much to let him freeze. Some prisons, he reflected, as Ghost batted at his hair, and Shadow tried to steal his breakfast, and Bear planted himself in front of the door every time the temperature dropped below 0, were the best places to be. You know, he said to Vera one evening, months later, as they watched the cubs chase each other across the frost-covered plains from the safety of their shared quarters. I used to think humans were the apex predators, the most adaptable species in the galaxy, the ones who could survive anything. Vera leaned into his side, her warmth a constant comfort against the cold world outside. And now, Marcus smiled, watching Bear tackle Ghost into a snowdrift while Shadow yowled in mock outrage. Now I think the most dangerous thing in the universe isn't strength or adaptability, or even intelligence. It's finding something worth protecting. He looked down at Vera, at the binding stone she now wore beside her family pendant, at the way her eyes glowed with a love that transcended species and planets and everything he'd ever thought possible. And being willing to stand in front of a door, no matter how cold it gets, to keep it safe. Vera reached up and kissed him softly. That, she said, is the most human thing you've ever said. And somewhere in the distance, 3 alien predators howled at the rising moons, their voices carrying across the frozen landscape like a promise. The pack was together. The cold could not touch them. And as long as they stood between danger and the ones they loved, it never would.